Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ray Hall Tech. I'm Richard, and in today's episode I want to talk about building this NAS that I have sitting behind me. It's a bit of a spoiler, but it does work and it works well. The reason I had to build this NAS is because back here in the corner I have an old Buffalo NAS station. It's only 4 terabytes in size, and unfortunately that particular model doesn't expand. It was built for home use or small office, home office type use, and just doesn't meet my needs anymore. And in building this NAS, I evaluated a few options, like buying something from TerraMaster or Synology, something that's targeted to small office or home office use. Something larger like a Dell EqualLogic or something like that would have been completely out of my price range. So again, building this, there's a few good reasons for it, and I'll talk about those in my conclusion, so stick around. I'll give some more reasoning behind this after I show you my hardware selection and all that kind of stuff in this video, and I'll break down my costs. So if you're looking for a NAS device, it might help you decide if you want to use an old computer like this, or if you want to go ahead and buy one of those really good options from TerraMaster or Synology or Buffalo or something like that. So let's get to it. For this NAS, I wanted to use hardware that I already have, and here on the desk is a lot of the hardware that I was looking at when I evaluated this process. I started looking. The first motherboard I looked at was this one here. I ruled it out pretty quick because it's old. It still has IDE and SATA ports, but it only has 4 SATA ports. So this board, even though it still works perfectly, it's just not going to be good enough for what I want to do. The next motherboard I considered using is this Intel desktop board. Now, it does have 6 SATA ports, which is a lot closer to my needs and wants, but it also has this USB so that I could run a boot drive and 6 storage drives. Unfortunately, TrueNAS doesn't want you to run from USB, so while I was considering this board, ultimately it did get ruled out. The two main reasons for that: the 6 SATA ports here are SATA 2, and then here the memory is ECC memory. I don't have any more ECC RAM, so I would have had to buy more RAM. That would increase the cost of the project, and I already bought some other stuff because of some issues I had, and I'm trying to keep the cost low. So ultimately I chose this motherboard that I have. It's a Gigabyte FX 990A, UD5 I believe, but I don't know if you can see this on camera, but there's 6 USB ports here and 2 up here, giving me a total of 8 ports. That will allow me to boot from an SSD and allow me still to use my 6 SATA drives, and with that 8th port I ended up actually finding a cache drive. So with the 6 drives, I actually wanted them to be external. You can see I have these drive sleds here. Each one lets me run 3 drives, and on the back they can take Molex power or SATA power. And unfortunately, these didn't work. I can only get 2 of the drives to show up in those bays, and that was actually my first problem. I troubleshooted for a little bit. I changed power connectors from Molex to SATA and did some board troubleshooting, but I'm going to have to fix those in the future, and they wouldn't work. So my first optional cost was the drive sleds that I put in here. You don't have to buy drive sleds if you have a case like this case. I could have put in the 5 drives here. Sorry, there's 4 drives in this cage, and then 2 in this bottom cage. And then my boot drives could have fit in this little adapter down here. But again, because I wanted them externally accessible, I bought drive sleds. So that's an optional cost. If you're building a low-cost NAS, you don't have to buy those. That did lead me into having to select a new motherboard. Power supply. This power supply has enough SATA connectors for my new drive sleds and all of my drives. Unfortunately, the old power supply only had Molex, and so it just didn't fit in this new case. Overall, it works out better because this is a 650 watt power supply, and at some point in the past the PCI Express power cables, since this is semi-modular, were lost, and so it can't really be used for anything since I only have SATA cables for it now. The original processor in this computer was an AMD FX 4300. Should go this way to be upright. That's a 2-core, 4-thread processor, and being it that I'm running a NAS, I wanted it to be a little bit faster just in case multiple people were accessing it. So I put in an 8370 that I had, and my next optional purchase was this fan right here from Micro Center. The original cooler and processor, they were just the OEM, and I was worried it might not cool just enough for this particular case. So I went ahead and put that cooler in. This cooler is an optional purchase because if you have a good CPU and cooler, you may not need to buy anything like that. So I'll cover all the costs when I'm wrapping up, but for now, this drive is just a dummy drive. It's a bad 1 terabyte drive. I'm just keeping it in there because it locks the rails in place and I don't want to lose them in a drawer somewhere. Right here, I have the Samsung 840, which is my boot drive. It's 120 gig. It's really not big enough for anything else. That's why I selected it as a boot drive. And then there's a cache drive in here. It's another Samsung drive. It's a little bit older, but it's 256 gigs. And then I have 5 new NAS drives from Western Digital in this slot. And then finally, the last piece of hardware is this video card. I just pulled that out of an HP or a Dell. It's just a generic video card that has HDMI output, and it may be going bad. I'm not sure yet, but if I connect it to one capture device, it always displays green. If I connect it to my other one, it works fine. Not quite sure what the difference is there, but when I plug a monitor in, it also looks fine on a monitor, so it just may be an incompatibility with my capture card. So with the hardware covered, let's get into installing TrueNAS. Now that we've talked about hardware and I booted up the system, I want to cover a few of my BIOS settings. The first thing, you'll notice that this is a 4 gigahertz processor, and I do have 16 gigabytes of RAM, so that is being all detected correctly. If I go to the System Information tab and down to ATA port information, you can see that 5 hard drives are detected. Those are my 4 gigabyte drives, and they're the ones that are connected to my South Bridge. So if I go over to Peripherals, you can see the South Bridge SATA configuration option here. When I select that, all of the SATA ports are hot pluggable, and that is enabled on all of those ports. That's, again, one of the great reasons for me to use this board is because with my external bays, I don't have to shut down the system to change them out. If the BIOS didn't support this, I could just shut down TrueNAS, swap it, boot it back up, and it will rebuild the ZFS array. And then if I hit Escape, you can see this Marvel SATA controller. So I have an optional Marvel controller. It has 2 SATA ports. That's what gives me the 8 total. And you can see the Samsung 840 on SATA port 0 down here, and then the Samsung PM whatever model it is on that secondary SATA port. Alright, so I'm going to come back over here. I have TrueNAS Core on my SanDisk Cruiser Glide here, and that's what we are going to be installing from. Alright, go ahead and force boot from my USB drive to install TrueNAS Core. I'm just going to hit Enter to load the installer. So TrueNAS Core is based on BSD. TrueNAS Scale is based on Debian. So you get a little bit more variety and capability with TrueNAS Scale, but because I'm just looking for NAS capability, I'm going to go ahead and just install TrueNAS Core. Let me go ahead and hit Install Upgrade here. So I'm going to go ahead and do a fresh install for the purposes of this NAS. I was playing with TrueNAS Scale and TrueNAS Core, and so with this install, this will be my permanent TrueNAS Core installation. And I want to format the boot device because I don't want a new boot environment, and I'm going to tell it to go ahead and erase that drive. Let me go ahead and type in my password. This is just the standard setup password I use for all of my systems. Once the system's up and running, I will generate a secure password from my password manager and give this system a unique password for security reasons. Alright, my system is configured to boot from UEFI only, so I'm going to go ahead and tell it to boot via UEFI. If your system is even older than mine, or you have it set to boot in BIOS mode, make sure you select the right option here, or your system won't boot. Now, if you only have 8 gigs of RAM and you're not going to create a cache, I would say create a swap file. But if you have 16 gigs of RAM or you have a cache drive, you don't need a swap file. So I'm going to skip creating this swap because I do have that 16 gigs of RAM. And one of the other things to take into consideration on this page, if you're going to be running those virtual machines and things like that, it may be beneficial for a swap, but then again, you need more memory if you're going to run VMs on this machine. So I'm going to say no swap, and I'm going to go ahead and let this install. It does take a while for it to install, but once it does its thing, you'll see that it'll go from this 80A5P2. It'll actually start doing a percentage here in a moment, and that's how you know it's going to be installing. One thing I should note is that I did swap the video card. That video card that kept showing up green on one capture card but worked fine with the other. Every time I tried to boot TrueNAS, I couldn't see the install prompt. It just wouldn't let me install anything, so I had to swap that card. Right now I have a GTX 750 in there, but I'm going to take that back out because I want to build a retro gaming machine with that card, but I will put in an NVIDIA Quadro that I have that I'm not using anything with. It's just that Quadro card, it only has DisplayPort and DVI, and I don't have anything that'll connect to that right now. I could order an adapter or something like that, but for now, we'll just let it sit. But I'm going to go ahead and let this get to 100% and reboot the computer. Once that's done, I will come back after the jump. So the primary installation is done, and I've rebooted the system. We need to wait for a minute. It's going to boot TrueNAS. You can hit enter or let it auto boot. But it's going to go ahead and go through the setup process now. So we've installed it to the hard drive, but it now has to configure everything to run on our machine. This does take a while. Here a little bit later, it will be creating a security key, 2048-bit encryption key. Here you go. This does take a little while, so I'm going to go ahead and let this do this, and I'll come back once the installation is complete, and we'll go from there. Now that the installation is complete, you can tell everything is good to go because right down here it says console setup. Once you get to this point, you know that everything is working, and we're good to go. There are a few options here, but you won't need these most of the time. The system is designed to run headless, but just know that these options are here. But the big thing that you may need if your web interface is not responding or something is this reboot and shut down, or resetting the root password if you forget that. But at this point, all we need is the IP address of the computer, which here in my network is 192.168.1.89. So I'm going to go ahead and switch from this system over to a web interface so that we can start to configure TrueNAS. Now that we're in a web browser, we're going to go to 192.168.1.89, the web address that was shown on the boot system there. And as you can see, that takes us to TrueNAS. The password will be root, and the password will be whatever you type during setup. Oop, mistyped it. Alright, I am on the TrueNAS system we just installed, and I am ready to start setting things up. The first thing that you're actually going to want to do is make it so that you can actually use the storage in the system, and to do that you have to create a storage pool. So if I hit storage and select pools, you can see I have no pools available. I'm going to go ahead and hit add, and we're going to create a new pool and create pool. Here on this page, you have to give your pool a name. So I'm just going to call this main pool. And you can enable encryption if you want. I am not going to do that since this is just a home system. If this was an enterprise system, I absolutely would turn on encryption. You can manually set your disks, which is the next piece. So if I select ADA0 and hit the arrow, you can see it's going to add this one disk over to my data VDEV. But I'm going to go ahead and hit Reset Layout. Here you have a Suggest Layout button. If you hit that, it'll go ahead and pull over everything that it thinks to make the best system for you. Now, if you look here, you can see it created a RAID 2, or RAID Z2, I should say. In this Z2 option, I'm only going to have about 10 terabytes of data, but it's using approximately 2 hard drives worth of space for parity. And in an enterprise where I have a lot more storage capabilities, that probably would be good. But I'm actually going to change to a RAID Z. I still want the protection, but I don't need as much protection as this pool is going to give me. And now you can see I'm going to have about 14.5 terabytes of usable space out of my 5 4-gig drives. The next thing I want to do, I mentioned I want to use a cache drive, and you can see that that drive is still sitting over here. So I'm going to hit Add VDEV and select Cache. Here, I'm going to go ahead and check my cache drive and use this arrow to bring it over into the cache VDEV. In the future, I need to get one more drive, but when I do that, I'll add another VDEV and create one of these hard drives when it's available as a hot spare, so that if any one of these drives fail, it'll pull in that hot spare, rebuild my array, and I can take out the bad drive in the future if I need to. But let's go ahead and hit Create. I'm going to confirm that I'm creating this pool because it's going to erase everything. In my case, it's fine because this pool is actually new drives and there's nothing on it. This solid state drive is used. I don't know what was on it. It's probably a Windows install or something, and I don't need its data, so I'm just going to hit Create Pool and wipe all of that so it's good to go. This will take just a minute or two. It's actually pretty quick, and we'll go ahead and just let it create that information. Alright, now I have a main pool file system made out of my drives. It is a ZFS file system, and I have 14 terabytes of usable space. Alright, so the next thing we're going to want to do, I'm going to go ahead and create some sharing. So right down here you can see sharing, and most of my computers are Windows shares. I'm going to select that, and I'm going to add a file share. So in my path, I'm going to go ahead and select my main pool, and then I'm going to type after it public, and that's going to create a folder called public in my main pool. I could share this main pool, but that's not really a good idea. If I create multiple types of shares and I just share out a main pool, everything is going to be available in that one system. And that includes, if I add any plugins, you can see right here there's a plugin service. If I were to add a plugin, say for a Plex server, it would show up in that main pool for use on the TrueNAS server. It's just not really a good idea. So I would say it's not best practice. But we're going to have a public drive, and I'm going to hit Submit. Because this is the first time we're creating a Windows share, it's going to ask me to enable Samba. So I'm going to go ahead and enable that. Close that message, and then it's going to ask if I want to configure the ACL. I'm going to go ahead and hit Configure Now. And the ACL options, I'm going to set this one to Open because this is my public directory. I want everybody to be able to access it. And then I'm going to hit Continue. And you really don't have to mess with any of these other settings right now. But notice this group wheel right here. The group wheel by default gets applied to most of the shares. So when you create a user, if you put them in wheel, they will often get access to these systems, to the shares automatically in the Linux file system. But I'm going to go ahead and hit Save. And now I have a pool and I have a share. If I go back to sharing and I hit Windows Shares, you can see that it created a mount main pool public. If I go back to accounts now, I'm going to add a user. By default, there's a lot of Linux built-in accounts for Samba and changing passwords and things, but only the root shows. That's what that message means. You can just ignore it. I'm going to go ahead and hit Add, and I'm going to add my account. We'll do array hall. I'm going to type my Windows password. And then we're going to confirm that. All right. So I'm going to create a user and a group called array hall. We're going to just create a new primary group. If I uncheck that, I can put them in a different primary group, but I don't need to do that. Here under auxiliary groups, I can scroll down. Oh, wait, it's at the top. If I select wheel, like I said, when you create shares, wheel is a default group on those shares. So if you add somebody to this auxiliary group, they will inherit the permissions that this group gets. So keep that in mind that you do have that option. But I'm going to go ahead and do mount main pool, and I'm going to create array hall because I want a home directory that just belongs to me. And by setting this directory up here, it is going to create the array hall folder in the main pool, and then we are good to go. I'm not going to modify any of these other bits of information because I really just want the user to be able to access it. But one thing I am going to change is Microsoft account. If I have any machines that are signed in with a Microsoft account, I want to make sure they can use that online authentication as opposed to just Samba authentication for a local user or a domain user. But I'm going to go ahead and hit submit. And now I have a user called array hall. One more thing that I'm going to do is go back into Windows shares. I'm going to add a share under mount main pool array hall because by default I created the folder but I didn't share it, and I'm just going to go ahead and share this so that I have access to it. And without changing anything else, I'm just going to hit submit, and once it comes up I'm going to configure its ACL, and on this one I'm going to select home. That way it's my home directory and it has permissions to just me as array hall. And with that, I'm going to hit save, and I don't need to change anything else. So now we have a fully working system. If I open a new window here, let's bring that over, type in the IP address of my server, which in this case is .89. I hit enter. What the heck? It just opened a browser window. I wonder if it was mad because I didn't type the double backslashes. It automatically passed through my username and password because I had a previous NAS and already saved the credentials for this IP address. But normally you'll be prompted for your credentials. Once you put them in, you can see that I have these two directories. If I go into public, I right-click, hit New and Folder. It created that folder showing you that this is actually an open directory. If I go into array hall, I can create a new folder, and it also created that showing that my directory permissions are set up for this. Now everybody should be able to access this, so my wife or my son can start saving data into this public folder, but none of them will have access to the array hall folder except for me. Alright, so back on this system, if you look at my dashboard now, you can see that CPU usage, memory usage is all listed right up here. And one of the reasons I said you didn't really need the swap partition, you can see here the ZFS cache because this is a home device and I'm not using a lot of simultaneous users. I don't need a lot of memory for cache. But if I needed a lot of users or I had a lot of VMs or something, that swap file may actually come in handy. But as I said, in my system, my deployment, that swap file wasn't necessary. And you can see now with so much free RAM why I didn't think it was necessary. The next thing I want to draw your attention to right here is the interface. You can see that I have an IP address here. Because this is my home environment, I let it actually just pull a DHCP address, and I will go into the app for my Netgear routers and set it as a reservation. That way that address never changes. If I was in an enterprise environment or in my home lab, if I wanted static addresses, now would be the time to configure that before you start actually connecting your systems, just to ensure that your IP address never changes and that you don't suddenly temporarily lose access to your NAS because of an IP address change. Then, while this isn't a full guide to TrueNAS, either Core or Scale, the next thing I want to draw your attention to is tasks. Here you can see I have tasks. If I go to scrub tasks, this is actually really important. A scrub task is created by default, but when you have a ZFS pool like we do, this scrub task, it's going to go through and look for data problems, data corruptions, anything like that, and it can actually give you some error alerts because your hardware might be failing or you have bad data written to the drive because of a processing issue. In my system, I'm not using ECC RAM, so I can have data corruption for that, but this will tell you that at ZFS pool level. And then if you go to Smart, you can see there's no Smart tasks set up by default, but I'm going to go ahead and add for all disks a short test once a week. And that way it's actually going to do a smart test on my hard drives and look at the physical hardware smart status. So even if my array is working correctly and ZFS doesn't find an error, the smart test can actually start to look for hardware errors and may find something that before ZFS finds something. Then I'm going to go ahead and add a long test, and we'll do that once a month. And we'll leave it at that for now for this video. But now that those are set up, I might get some hardware warnings before any hardware failures, or over here, if there's a ZFS error, I'll get warnings and won't lose any of my data. So with that, that covers the basics of setting up TrueNAS and getting the system up and running and working properly. If you have any questions about this, definitely throw them down in the comments. In today's video, I walked you through my hardware selection and put TrueNAS Core on my NAS back here. Everybody's needs are going to be a little bit different, so if you want to put something together yourself like I did, or buy something from a vendor like Synology or TerraMaster, that's still perfectly okay. But when I'm looking at costs, a TerraMaster or a Synology, the prices ranged from low 200s to enterprise level multiple thousands of dollars. And when I'm looking at the capability of something like TrueNAS, I really felt that a $500 device was approximately where the feature set landed for something that I could build for myself. And with all being said and done, hardware and drives, I was looking at $1,000 to buy something off the shelf from one of those vendors. And my costs was less than that. And so I think making the system myself was the way to go. I had to buy drives. The storage drives were brand new Western Digital Red drives. They are NAS drives. They cost me like $89 each or something like that, plus shipping and tax. So it ended up being right around $450 for the 5 drives that I bought. And on top of that, I wanted my drives external. Unfortunately, my old sleds were broken, so I bought new ones. That was an optional cost, but they cost me about $100 a piece, so I spent $200 on those extra sleds. And as you saw, my BIOS has them all hot pluggable, so I can swap those anytime something dies without having to take my system down. And as I rely more and more on this network storage, that's going to be something that's very important to me. Next, I swapped my CPU, and I spent $42 on a CPU cooler just to make sure that that OEM cooler that may not have been able to keep my FX cool could keep this FX 8730 cold enough to run happy and healthy. And so my hardware choices were purely based on this being a home device. There's no ECC memory or anything like that. So make sure whatever hardware you pick meets the needs that you have. with that being said, again, I spent $692 on my unit, but about $242 of that were my custom changes to get those external drives. So if you have the hardware, want to install TrueNAS, either Core or Scale, which is free, the process seems to be identical to me. I really couldn't tell the difference between the two as far as usability goes, but it's definitely something to take a look at. Now, in the video, I didn't cover what I think is important for backup purposes. This drive is got one copy of data, and my main computer has a copy of data. My wife's computer has her copy of data. I use this as a backup source that is off my main computers. But because this is kind of more of a backup than a main storage device right now, only my important stuff actually goes out to the cloud, because you need a backup for your NAS. So if this is your primary storage device, definitely devise some kind of backup solution. Have two NASs back up to the cloud, buy a storage plan that can cover your, in this case, 15 terabytes of storage, whatever. But don't skip the backup, because it's mechanical, it's electrical, it will fail. And in my area, it's a really old area. We have a lot of power failures and power fluctuations. And here you can see, I pulled my NAS out away from the wall so you can see it. On my NAS, I have a 900 watt rated NAS. With my systems running at idle like this all the time, they're pulling about 140 watts. I'm sure I could replace the hardware and lower that, but you know, using an old computer for a NAS, I'm going to suck a little bit more power. Definitely have a UPS for your storage. If you have any power fluctuations or anything, my UPS is configured to shut down my NAS server. That way it has time to flush everything to disk and shut down the system. I don't want to lose data or have data corruption due to a power issue. So definitely with a NAS, get a UPS so that you can protect your data. So with that, if you have any questions, throw them down in the comments like I said earlier. Let me know what you like about this video, if you didn't like something, and please give me that thumbs up on this video. It helps me out quite a bit, and if you like my content, definitely subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in a future video.